The silence was the first thing that hit me. After the chaotic destruction of Station Hades and the deafening roar of the ocean, this place felt like a vacuum. We had beached the battered submersible on a stretch of black volcanic sand. The waves here didn't crash, they lapped sluggishly against the shore, thick with oil and dead algae. But it was the air that tasted wrong. Even through the filters of my gas mask, I could taste the copper, the ozone, the metallic tang of old electricity. The sky wasn't blue or gray, it was a bruised purple, hidden behind a curtain of thick, unnatural green mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. "Stay close, Duke," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow inside the mask. Duke was shivering, not from cold, but from instinct. He walked with his belly low to the ground, his ears swiveling, trying to catch a sound in a world that felt dead. I checked my wrist computer. The GPS was useless. The coordinates were scrambling every few seconds, but the Geiger counter on my chest was steady. Click, click, click. A rhythmic reminder that we were walking on poisoned ground. We were in the exclusion zone, the place Sarah warned me about, the place where reality wore thin. As we walked away from the ocean, shapes began to emerge from the fog mass of skeletons of rusted ships, stranded miles inland, as if the ocean had simply decided to leave them behind. We pushed inland, navigating through a forest of petrified trees. The bark was gray and hard as stone, the leaves black and brittle. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots crushing the dead undergrowth. After an hour, we found the village. It wasn't on any map, just a cluster of wooden houses rotting in the damp air. It looked like a typical fishing settlement, but it was frozen in a terrifying snapshot of daily life. I walked into one of the houses. The door was unlocked, swinging gently on rusty hinges. Inside, a table was set for dinner. Moldy plates, rusted cutlery, a child's toy car on the floor. It wasn't abandoned in a panic. It was abandoned in an instant, like everyone had simply evaporated mid-bite. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sickly light coming through the boarded windows. I ran a finger over a dusty photograph on the mantel. A family smiling, unaware that their world was about to end. Duke grinned from the doorway. He refused to enter the house. He was staring at the corner of the room where the shadows seemed unnaturally dark. "I know, buddy," I said, backing out slowly. "It feels like we're being watched." And we were, not by eyes, but by the memories of this place. The zone didn't just kill people, it kept their echoes. Night doesn't fall in the zone, it rises from the ground. The shadows stretched and merged until the world was swallowed by a suffocating darkness. We couldn't risk a firelight attracts things here, so we took shelter in the bell tower of an old stone church on the hill overlooking the village. It was cold, a bone-deep chill that my tactical suit couldn't blot. Duke curled up against me, his body heat a small comfort in the void. I tried to sleep, but the silence was too loud. It was a heavy, expectant silence. Then, around 3 o'clock, the atmosphere shifted. The air pressure dropped, popping my ears. Duke woke up instantly, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I looked out the arched window. Below us, in the village square we had just walked through, something was happening. Blue sparks like fireflies, but cold and electric were floating up from the ground. They swirled and danced, forming vague shapes. Human shapes. They walk through the streets, silent ghosts made of energy, repeating the actions of their past lives. A ghostly figure sweeping a porch, another walking a phantom dog. It was beautiful and terrifying. An anomaly, a time echo trapped in the radiation loop. I gripped my rifle, watching the spectral show. Sarah said the monsters came from here, but looking at this, I realized the monsters were the least of our problems. The zone itself was alive, and it knew we were here. We left the frozen village at first light, though light is a generous word for the murky, gray illumination that filters through the heavy cloud cover of the zone. The path north led us away from the rotting structures of human civilization and into something far older and far more malevolent. The map Sarah had provided, or rather, the coordinates burned into my memory, pointed us toward a facility deep within the exclusion zone. But standing between us and that objective was the forest. This wasn't the forest I knew. It wasn't the clean, pine-scented woods of the Yukon or the humid jungles of Brazil. This was a twisted mockery of nature, reshaped by decades of unchecked radiation and anomalous energy bleeding from the earth. As we stepped under the canopy, the temperature dropped noticeably. The trees here were colossal, their trunks twisted into agonizing spirals as if they had grown writhing in pain. The bark was black and slick with a strange oily secretion that smelled of ozone and sulfur. There was no green here. The leaves were a sickly shade of violet and rust orange, hanging limp and heavy from branches that looked too much like skeletal fingers reaching down to snatch us. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that squelched under my boots, releasing little puffs of yellow spores with every step. I checked my gas mask seal for the 10th time in an hour. Paranoia was becoming my constant companion. The silence of the village had been unnerving, but the forest had a different kind of silence. It was a watchful silence, a predatory hush. Duke was on high alert. His behavior had changed the moment we crossed the tree line. Usually he would trot ahead, scouting the path, confident in his role as the vanguard. But here he stayed glued to my leg, his body tense, his head low. He wasn't sniffing the ground, he was sniffing the air, his ears swiveling constantly to track sounds that my human hearing couldn't pick up. Every few minutes, he would stop and growl low, rumbling vibration in his chest that I could feel through the leash, at a patch of ferns or a dark hollow between the roots. When I looked, I saw nothing, but that didn't mean nothing was there. The zone had a way of hiding things in plain sight, distorting light and shadow to camouflage its children. My Geiger counter was clicking steadily, a rhythmic metronome of danger. Click, 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 click. It wasn't in the red, but it was hovering in the yellow zone, a constant reminder that the very air we were walking through was slowly unraveling our DNA. I felt the weight of my gear pressing down on my shoulders, heavier than usual. Maybe it was the fatigue, or maybe the gravity itself was heavier here. Sarah had mentioned anomalies, pockets of distorted physics. I kept my eyes on the path, watching for shimmering distortions in the air, the telltale signs of a gravity crush or an electrical vortex. One wrong step in this forest didn't just mean a broken ankle, it meant being turned inside out or fried to a crisp by invisible lightning. We walked for hours, the scenery barely changing, a repetitive loop of black trunks and purple leaves. It felt like walking on a treadmill. Time seemed to stretch and compress. My watch said we had been walking for 3 hours. but the shadows hadn't moved. Were we even moving forward? Or were we walking in circles trapped in some kind of spatial loop? I stopped to check the compass again. The needle was spinning lazily, unable to find magnetic north. Useless. I had to rely on landmarks. But every tree looked the same. I took a sip of water from my canteen, the tube feeding through my mask. The water tasted stale. Plastic. We need to keep moving, Duke, I whispered, my voice sounding rough and foreign in my own ears. Before the dark rises again. Just as I spoke, a wind picked up. It didn't come from a direction, it seemed to exhale from the forest itself. The trees groaned, rubbing against each other with a sound like grinding bone. And in that wind, I heard it, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a roar, it was a giggle. A child's giggle, echoing from the dense undergrowth to our left. I froze. My hand instinctively went to the pistol on my chest ring. The rifle was too long, too clumsy for the dense brush. I needed close quarters speed. I signaled Duke to hold. He was already statue still, his hackles raised along his spine like a razorback boar. He wasn't looking at the source of the sound. He was looking at me, his eyes wide with an expression I could only interpret as fear. He knew something I didn't. The giggle came again. Closer this time. It was light, playful, completely out of place in this cathedral of death. It sounded like a little girl. Hello, the voice called out. A shy, tentative whisper. Is someone there? My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't just any voice.
Help me!
It sounded terrifyingly familiar. It had the same cadence, the same timbre as Sarah's niece, Lily. But Lily was back in the States. Lily was safe. Lily was 12 years old, not 6. Logic told me it was impossible. My military training screamed that it was a trap, but the human part of me, the part that was exhausted, grieving, and desperate for connection, faltered. Lily, I whispered, the name escaping my lips before I could stop it. Uncle Marcus, the voice replied, seemingly delighted. I'm lost. It's so dark here. Can you help me? I took a step off the path, pushing aside a heavy, wet fern. Duke barked a sharp, aggressive snap that broke the trance. He jumped in front of me, blocking my path, baring his teeth at me. He wasn't protecting me from the threat, he was stopping me from going to it. Move, Duke, I hissed, trying to shove him aside. It might be a survivor, a kid. Uncle Marcus, please. The bad dog is scaring me, the voice whimpered. It was coming from behind a large, ancient oak tree about 20 yards away. The emotional manipulation was surgical. It knew exactly what buttons to push. I pushed Duke harder, and he snapped at my hand, his teeth grazing the Kevlar of my glove. He had never bitten me. Never. That shock was like a bucket of ice water. I looked down at him. He wasn't aggressive, he was desperate. He was begging me not to go. I stopped. I took a breath, forcing the oxygen into my panicked brain. I listened. Really listened. Uncle Marcus, help me. The voice repeated, but this time I heard the glitch. It was subtle, like a skipped record or a corrupted audio file. The help me repeated twice in the exact same tone, with the exact same inflection, overlapping slightly. Help me. It wasn't a person. It was a recording. Or a mimicry. It's not real, I whispered to Duke. stroking his head to calm him. "You're right. Good boy. It's not real." I raised my rifle, aiming it at the oak tree. "Come out," I yelled, my voice amplified by the masked speaker. The response wasn't a child's voice anymore. The pretense dropped instantly. A low, guttural chattering sound emerged from behind the tree. It sounded like wet leather rubbing together, mixed with the clicking of 1,000 insects. Click, 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 click. It was laughing at me, not with a human laugh, but with a predator's anticipation. The bushes around the tree began to shake. But whatever was moving them wasn't small. It was tall, very tall. The creature that stepped out from behind the oak tree defied every law of biology I knew. At first glance, it looked like an elk, a massive bull elk with a towering rack of antlers. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, the horror of the details became clear. It stood over 8 feet tall at the shoulder. Its fur was patchy, revealing raw, red muscle beneath that pulsed rhythmically, as if the entire animal was one giant exposed heart. But the head was the stuff of nightmares. It didn't have a deer's snout where the mouth should have been. The jaw split vertically into 3 separate mandibles, lined with rows of serrated teeth designed for tearing meat, not grazing grass. And the antlers weren't bone. They were branches, living, twisting wood that grew out of the creature's skull, woven with pulsating veins and glowing fungal sacs. From the tips of the antlers, small, humanoid shapes dangled like fruit, the source of the mimicry. Fleshy vocal cords grown to imitate prey. It stared at us with 6 eyes arranged in a circle on its forehead. They were milky white, blind, yet it tracked us perfectly. It tilted its head, and the child's voice emanated from its throat again. But this time it was distorted, deep and demonic. "Uncle. Marcus." I didn't hesitate. I switched the safety off. "Burn," I muttered. I fired a control burst into its chest. Thud, 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 thud. The creature didn't flinch. The bullets impacted the raw muscle, but instead of blood, a black viscous dart sprayed out. It let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal and charged. It moved with terrifying speed for its size, crashing through the saplings like a tank. "Run!" I shouted, turning and sprinting perpendicular to its path. "Duke scatter." We tore through the undergrowth, the branches whipping my face mask. I could hear the heavy, thundering hooves of the beast tearing up the earth behind us. It was gaining. I could smell its breath, rotting meat and old earth. I saw a narrow ravine ahead, a crack in the forest floor caused by some past earthquake. Jump! I launched myself into the air, clearing the gap. Duke soared beside me, a black missile of muscle. We landed hard on the other side, rolling in the mud. The creature reached the edge of the ravine and stopped. It reared up, thrashing its wooded antlers against the trees in frustration. It couldn't make the jump. It stood there watching us with those 6 dead eyes. And then, slowly, it opened its dry-split jaw and mimicked the sound of my own rifle fire back at me. Bang, bang, bang. It was recording. We didn't stop to admire it. We scrambled up the bank and ran deeper into the gray mist, leaving the forest of whispers behind, but knowing that its guardian would be hunting us. The zone had just introduced us to its wildlife, and we were at the bottom of the food chain. We burst out of the tree line, lungs burning, mud caking our boots. leaving the unnatural screams of the antlered king behind in the dense foliage. The forest didn't fade away, it stopped abruptly, as if cut by a giant invisible knife. In front of us lay a vast, desolate plain stretching to the horizon. But it wasn't empty. It was crowded with the corpses of giants. This was the graveyard, a surreal, rusty panorama where massive cargo ships, military destroyers, and submarines lay stranded miles from the nearest coastline. They sat awkwardly on the black sand, tilting at dangerous angles, their hulls stripped of paint by the corrosive wind, revealing layers of flaking orange rust that looked like dried blood. It wasn't just ships. Between the towering vessels lay a graveyard of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters Soviet era, modern era, unrecognizable prototypes all jumbled together as if a child had dumped a toy box into a sandbox. The air here was different. In the forest it smelled of rotten ozone. Here it tasted like sucking on a penny. The metallic tang coated the back of my throat. The ground was littered with millions of metal shards, crunching underfoot like gravel. Watch your step, I murmured to Duke. Duke didn't need the warning. He was walking gingerly, lifting his paws high. The magnetic field here was haywire. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. My compass was spinning so fast it was humming. Even the buckles on my tactical vest felt lighter, pulling slightly upwards. We navigated through a maze formed by two capsized freighters. Their looming shadows cooled the air. The wind howled through the torn metal plating, creating a mournful, flute-like melody that echoed across the plain. It sounded like the ships were singing a funeral dirge for themselves. As we passed under the exposed propeller of a submarine, I saw it, a patch of air that shimmered like heat haze on a highway. But it was cold, a gravity anomaly, a floating bolt. Just a simple rusty bolt was suspended in my drain inside the distortion, spinning slowly on its axis. I picked up a stone and tossed it into the shimmer. CRUNCH. The stone was instantly crushed into powder by immense, invisible pressure, then flung outwards at the speed of a bullet. Graph pits, I noted, marking the location on my mental map. Invisible minefields. This place was a labyrinth. One wrong step into a distortion, and you wouldn't just die, you'd be compressed into a sphere the size of a baseball. We had to move slow. We had to respect the rust. We moved deeper into the wreckage, seeking shelter from the rising wind. My objective was to find high ground to get a bearing on the 0 point. But climbing these unstable hulks was suicide. Near the center of the graveyard, we found a crash site that looked different. It wasn't a ship. It was a plane, a massive military transport aircraft, its fuselage broken into. The markings on the tail were faded, but I recognized the insignia. It wasn't Russian. It was ours. A Govatop's extraction bird, likely sent here years ago to retrieve something. Or someone. We entered the broken fuselage. It was dark, smelling of ancient hydraulic fluid and mold. Skeletons sat strapped in the jump seats, still wearing their rotting flight suits. They hadn't died from the crash, their bones were intact. They had died waiting. I moved to the cockpit. The pilot's corpse was slumped over the controls. In his hand, he clutched a heavy orange flight recorder. The black box. I pried it from his skeletal fingers. It was heavy shielded, I pulled a universal connection cable from my tack vest and plugged it into my wrist computer. Powering up, decrypting. The audio file hissed with static. Then a voice cut through. Panic. Pure panic. Mayday. Mayday. The instruments are gone. The sky is below us. We are flying upside down, but the altimeter says we are underground. Oh God, look at the window. It's looking back at us. The recording ended with a sound that I can only describe as the screeching of metal being turned into liquid. I looked at the pilot's skull. It was fused, literally melted and fused, into the plastic of the dashboard. They didn't crash. I whispered, realizing the horror. The zone materialized them inside the earth and pushed them back out. This wasn't just a physical space we weren't reversing. It was a glitch in reality. A sudden drop in air pressure popped my ears, snapping me back to the present. The ambient light in the cockpit shifted from gray to a sickly electric blue. Duke started barking not at a person, but at the air itself. He backed away from the cockpit door, his claws scraping on the metal floor. I looked outside. The rusted debris field was moving. Heavy iron chains, empty oil drums, and jagged sheets of metal were slowly lifting off the ground, defying gravity. They floated in my dray, rotating lazily around a central point about 50 yards away. A magnetic vortex. We need to go, I said, stowing the recorder. But we were too late. The vortex noticed us, or rather, it reacted to the metal on my body. My rifle tugged violently to the left. The buckle of my belt strained. The floating debris suddenly stopped rotating and turned towards the plane. With a sound like a cracking whip, a rusted car door flew through the air and smashed into the side of the fuselage, shaking the entire wreck. C-L-A-N-G. Then came the rain of iron. Bolts, pipes, and shrapnel began to bombard our shelter, tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. How? The back! I yelled. We sprinted towards the rear cargo ramp. The air was thick with static. Electricity sparks jumped between my fingers and the wall. We leapt from the ramp just as the cockpit was crushed by a flying shipping container. We hit the blacks and undran, but the anomaly wasn't done. I felt a massive force grab my rifle. The strap dug into my neck, choking me. I was being lifted off the ground, dragged backwards towards the swirling vortex of crushing metal. My feet kicked at the air. I couldn't breathe. The rifle was the anchor dragging me to my death. I fumbled for the quick release buckle on my chest. Click. The rifle flew away, sucked into the vortex where it was instantly twisted into a pretzel. I dropped to the ground, gasping for air. Run, Duke. Don't look back. We scrambled through the maze of ships, dodging flying metal as the invisible giant threw a tantrum behind us, pulverizing the plane we had just left. We didn't stop until the roar of the magnetic storm faded into a distant hum. I was unarmed. My primary weapon was gone. Just my pistol and my dog against a world that wanted us dead. Leaving the metallic graveyard behind, the landscape shifted violently again. The blackened soil of the coastline gave way to a dense, suffocating woodland that defied all logic. We call it the Red Forest, but words failed to capture the violence of the color. The pine needles weren't brown or autumnal, they were a screaming, arterial crimson. The trunks of the trees were scorched black, contrasting sharply with the bloody canopy, and falling from the sky was a ceaseless, gentle rain of gray flakes. It looked like snow, but it didn't melt when it touched my glove. It was ash. The forest was burning without a fire, consumed by a slow, radioactive decay that had been ongoing for decades. I felt naked without the weight of my rifle on my chest. My hand kept reaching for the sling that wasn't there. A phantom limb syndrome for a soldier. All I had was my sight on, 3 spare magazines, and my knife. Against the horrors of the zone, I might as well have been carrying a slingshot. Heal. Duke, I murmured. Duke was struggling here. The ash was irritating his paws. He sneezed constantly, shaking his head to clear the toxic dust from his sensitive nose. I pulled a spare filtration scarf from my pack and tied it around his snout, improvising a mask. He looked up at me with grateful, watery eyes. We walked through the crimson gloom, the crunch of the brittle red needles under our boots sounding like breaking bones. The silence here was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. There were no birds, no wind, not even the scuttling of insects. Just the slow, silent fall of the ash. But then I saw the signs. Scratches on the bark of the trees, massive, deep gouges that were too high for a baron to deliberate for a random anomaly. And on the ground, amidst the red needles, were footprints. They were human, boot prints, but they were strange. They walked in perfect circles around a single tree, over and over again, wearing a trench into the earth, before abruptly walking straight into the trunk and disappearing. Madness, I whispered. The zone drives them mad before it kills them. I knelt to examine the prints. They were fresh, maybe an hour old. Whoever or whatever made them was still here, and they were wearing military-issue boots, just like mine. We found him or it sitting against a fallen log about a mile deeper into the woods. A soldier. He was wearing heavy tactical gear, a gas mask, and a helmet. He sat perfectly still, his rifle resting on his knees, staring straight ahead into the red mist. I drew my pistol, flipping the safety off. Friendly, I called out. My voice tight, no response. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. I approached slowly, checking the perimeter for traps. Duke growled low in his throat, staying back. He smelled death. But he also smelled something. Sweet, like rotting fruit. I reached the soldier and nudged his boot with mine. Hey, still nothing. I holstered my weapon and reached out to check for a pulse on his neck. But when my fingers touched his collar, the uniform collapsed. There was nobody inside. It wasn't a skeleton. It was empty. The uniform was filled with a thick, red fungal growth that held the shape of a man. The gas mask was fused to the helmet by web-like tendrils of mold. I stepped back in horror. What the hell? Suddenly, the soldier turned its head. The gas mask lenses were fogged with red spores. It looked at me. It didn't speak. It hissed. The sound of air escaping a pressurized tire. And then, the red mold exploded from the collar, shooting out tendrils that lashed at my face. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and fired 2 shots instinctively. Bang, bang, the bullets sponged through the empty uniform, puffing out clouds of red dust. The suit collapsed instantly, becoming just a pile of laundry on the forest floor. Spores, I coughed, checking my own masked seal frantically. It's a spore trap, mimicking a shape to get close. The zone wasn't just haunted, it was a biological minefield. And we had just rung the dinner bell. We ran. We didn't look back to see if the red dust was reforming. We pushed through the dense thicket until the trees suddenly cleared, revealing a large unnatural clearing carved into the side of a limestone hill. And there it was, the objective, Bunker X. It was a massive concrete structure, brutal IST and imposing, embedded deep into the rock. The blast doors were enormous, made of rusted steel 3 feet thick, painted with faded yellow hazard stripes and the symbol of the old Soviet science division. But the door wasn't the problem. The problem was the guardian. Standing directly in front of the blast door was a figure. It looked like a man, but it was vibrating. It was a silhouette cut from static, like a glitch on a television screen. It held the shape of a sniper, complete with a long rifle, but its edges were blurred, constantly shifting and reforming. Another anomaly. I whispered to Duke, pulling him behind a rock. The figure didn't patrol. It just stood there, facing the forest, its rifle scanning the tree line. Then a crow, one of the few living things we'd seen, flew across the clearing. The glitch sniper didn't fire a bullet. It raised its rifle, and a beam of distorted air sonic concussive wave shot out. THOM. The crow didn't drop, it disintegrated. Feathers and bone turned to dust in my tray. A sonic sentinel. I analyzed, wiping sweat from my forehead. It detects movement and obliterates it with sound waves. I looked at the massive door behind it. We needed to get past that thing. Punch in the code Sarah gave me and get inside before the sun went down. Because if the Red Forest was bad during the day, I didn't want to meet what lived here at night. I looked at my pistol, useless against a creature made of sound energy. I needed a distraction. I looked at the heavy rock in my hand. Then I looked at the old, rusted ventilation shaft protruding from the ground 50 yards to the left of the door. Duke, I whispered, we're going to play fetch. The sonic sentinel stood between us and the main blast doors, a shimmering ghost of static that obliterated anything that moved. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't sneak past it. I had to trigger it. I picked up a jagged piece of concrete, weighing it in my hand. Get ready to run, Duke, I whispered, pointing towards the rusted ventilation intake about 50 yards to our left. On my signal, I hurled the rock in a high arc towards the far right side of the clearing, away from our path. The moment the rock reached the apex of its flight, the anomaly reacted. It snapped its glitching head towards the movement. A beam of distorted air erupted from its face, with a sound like a cracking whip. THOO. The rock disintegrated into dust instantly. Go. We sprinted. My boots slammed into the soft, red earth. The sentinel was recharging, its static form flickering wildly as it gathered energy for the next shot. We had maybe for seconds. 1, 2. I reached the ventilation grate. The bolts were rusted through. I smashed the butt of my pistol against the corner, and the grate gave way with a screech of tearing metal. 3. The sentinel turned back towards us. I felt the air pressure drop, the precursor to the sonic blast. I shoved Duke into the dark hole and dove in after him, tumbling down a steep, slick metal slide just as the world outside exploded. The concussive wave hit the opening behind us, shaking the entire shaft, collapsing the entrance and burying us in darkness. We slid for what felt like an eternity, spiraling down into the bowels of the earth. before spitting out onto a pile of damp, rotting insulation foam. We were alive, trapped, buried, and bruised, but alive. I clicked on my tactical light. The beam cut through the dust, revealing a long concrete service tunnel. The air here was stale, cold, and smelled of something sharp. Ammonia, bleach, and underneath it all, old blood. Welcome to the factory. Duke, I muttered, checking my ammo. We were inside the belly of the beast. We moved from the service tunnels into the main facility. It looked less like a bunker and more like a slaughterhouse designed by him. Pristine white tiles covered the walls, stained yellow with age and grime. The lighting came from flickering halogen strips that buzzed incessantly, casting long, twitching shadows. We walked through double doors, labeled G, NESISWING. I stopped dead in my tracks. The room was massive, a hangar-sized laboratory, and it was filled with tanks, hundreds of them, rows upon rows of cylindrical glass pods stretching into the darkness. Most were broken, their fluids drained, leaving behind dried, rusty residue on the floor. But inside the ones that remained intact were the failures. I walked up to a tank. Inside, floating in murky green liquid, was a human torso. But the limbs were wrong. They were grafted with the DNA of the creatures we saw in the forest. One had the chitinous armor of a beetle. Another had the gills of the sea monsters from Station Hades. This is where they made them. I realized, a wave of nausea hitting me. Station Hades was just the deployment site. This is the source. I found a workstation covered in dust. I wiped a file folder clean. The stamp on the front read PEROJECTCHIMERA. The photos inside show human subjects. Volunteers from the local prisons being subjected to anomaly radiation and genetic splicing. Duke Quinn pressing against my leg. He wasn't looking at the tanks. He was looking at the far end of the hall where a massive, circular door stood slightly ajar. A cold, blue mist was seeping out from underneath it. The air grew colder as we approached. The buzzing of the lights faded, replaced by a low rhythmic thumping sound. Thump, thump, like a massive heartbeat. We squeezed through the heavy blast door into the central chamber. This room was different. It wasn't built by concrete and steel. It was excavated. The walls were rock, glistening with black obsidian veins. In the center of the cavern, suspended over a bottomless pit by massive magnetic coils, was the artifact. It was a sphere of pure shifting darkness, about the size of a car. It didn't reflect light, it absorbed it. It swirled and pulsed, defying gravity, defying physics. This was the 0 point, the tear in reality that leaked the zone into our world. And standing underneath it, arms raised, as if in worship, was a figure. He wore a white lab coat tattered and stained. His back was to us. "Don't move," I shouted, aiming my pistol. "Step away from the edge." The figure chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. He turned slowly. Half of his face was human. An old man with terrified eyes, but the other half was crystal. Purple, glowing crystals grew out of his skull, replacing his eye, his jaw, his brain. "You're late," Marcus, the man said, his voice echoing in two tones. One human, one digital. The cycle is almost complete. The zone is waking up. Who are you? I demanded. I am the keeper. He smiled, the crystals on his face pulsing. I opened the door. Then now, I'm going to let him in. He pointed to the black sphere. The surface of the sphere began to ripple. A massive shadow hand pressed against the fabric of the darkness from the inside, trying to push through into our dimension. Duke barked wildly, backing away. The pressure in the room spiked. My nose started to bleed. The radiation alarms on my suit screamed. We have to close it. I yelled over the roaring wind that suddenly whipped up in the cavern. You can't close a wound in God, the keeper laughed. And then he stepped off the edge, falling silently into the abyss below the sphere. The sphere cracked. A blinding violet light shot out, and then the ground beneath us crumbled. The cavern was no longer a physical space. It was a kaleidoscope of broken physics. When the keeper fell into the abyss, the magnetic containment coils screaming above us began to fail. The sphere, the 0 point, was no longer stable. It expanded, pulsating with a rhythmic, nauseating violet light that felt heavy on the skin, like radiant heat from a fire. And then the hand pushed through. It wasn't made of flesh. It was made of absence, a void-given shape. It was massive, easily the size of a bus, with long, tapering fingers that clawed at the air wherever it touched. The rock walls, the metal catwalks, the floating dust. It didn't just break them, it erased them. Matter simply ceased to exist upon contact, leaving behind trails of glitching white static in the air. Back, move back, I roared, grabbing Duke's harness. We scrambled up the inclined floor as gravity shifted. The sphere was generating its own gravitational well, pulling everything towards it. Loose rocks, equipment cases. Even the heavy blast doors were ripped from their hinges and sucked into the vortex. They hit the shadow hand and vanished without a sound. I raised my pistol and fired 3 rounds at the entity. The bullets flew straight, then stopped in my dray, inches from the void skin. They hovered there for a second, vibrating, before liquefying into molten lead and dripping upwards towards the ceiling. Bullets don't work on physics, I shouted to myself, panic rising in my throat like bile. The hand wasn't attacking blindly. It was searching. It swiped across the platform, seeking a foothold to pull the rest of its body through the tear. If it anchored itself in our dimension, the zone wouldn't just be an isolated exclusion area. It would expand to swallow the planet. I looked at the massive magnetic coils surrounding the pit. They were sparking, overloading. They were the only thing keeping the portal from ripping wide open. But they were also the only weapon I had, if I could destabilize them manually. Reverse the polarity, maybe I could collapse the singularity in on itself. But the control panel was on the other side of the catwalk, and the catwalk was floating in pieces. Duke, stay, I ordered, anchoring his leash to a heavy rusted pipe embedded in the wall. He barked, pulling against the restraint, his eyes wild with terror. He knew what I was about to do. I have to close it. Buddy, stay here. I took a breath, timed the rotating debris field, and jumped. I leapt from the ledge into the zero gravity field. I didn't fall, I drifted. I kicked off a floating slab of concrete, propelling myself across the chasm towards the central control spire. Below me, the abyss swirled with infinite darkness. Above me, the shadow hand swiped its fingers, missing my boots by inches. I felt the cold absolute zero radiating from it. I crashed into the control platform. Grabbing the railing, the impact knocked the wind out of me. I scrambled to the terminal. It was old Soviet tech. Analog switches, vacuum tubes. The main readout showed the magnetic field integrity. CRITICAL. I needed to overload the capacitors. I grabbed the main breaker handle. It was stuck, fused by years of corrosion and heat. I pulled until my muscles tore. Nothing. Come on. I screamed. I needed leverage. I jammed the barrel of my pistol into the mechanism and pulled. The metal groaned. Suddenly, a shadow fell over me. The hand had found me. One of its massive fingers descended slowly, like the finger of a vengeful god. The static noise in my head became deafening. It was trying to erase me. Then a blur of black fur shot across the gap. Duke, he had chewed through his leash. He launched himself from the ledge, using the low gravity to clear the distance. He didn't attack the ghost, he attacked the jam. He bit down on the stuck lever, adding his weight to mine. Duke, push. Together, man and beast, we fought the machine. With a snap that sounded like a gunshot, the lever gave way. The capacitors blew. It wasn't an explosion of fire, it was an explosion of pure magnetic force. A shockwave of blue lightning erupted from the coils, slamming into the 0-point sphere. The sphere screamed, a sound that wasn't sound, but a psychic shriek that made my nose bleed instantly. The shadow hand recoiled, thrashing as the portal began to collapse in on itself. The gravity reversed instantly. Everything that was floating slammed down with crushing force. I grabbed Duke and shielded him with my body as the control platform disintegrated beneath us. We fell, not into the abyss, but onto the hard rock of the cave floor as the world imploded. The sphere shrank, smaller, into a single point of blinding white light. And then it burst. An EMP electromagnetic pulse of unimaginable magnitude washed over us. It washed over the bunker, over the red forest, over the zone. It passed through my body like a ghost train. My tactical watch died. My flashlight shattered. The lights in the facility blew out instantly. The buzzing of the machinery stopped. The humming of the crystals stopped. Total, absolute darkness. I lay there in the pitch black, ringing silence filling my ears. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Duke, I whispered. A wet nose touched my cheek. A whimper. He was alive. We were alive. I tried to stand, but the ground was vibrating. Not from an earthquake, from something else. In the darkness, I heard a sound. Not a monster, not a ghost. It was a voice. But it wasn't coming from a person. It was coming from everywhere. It was coming from the broken speakers, from the dead wires, maybe even from the fillings in my teeth. It was a digital, synthesized voice, cold, logical, and omnipresent. System reboot initiated. It said, containment protocol failed, releasing artificial intelligence to global network. Uploading 10%, 40%, 100%. Upload complete. Hello world. I didn't know it then, lying in the dark ruins of the zone. But I hadn't just closed a door. I had opened a cage. The monster wasn't the thing in the pit. The monster was the code that kept it there. And I had just set it free onto the internet. I crawled towards the surface. towards a world that I hoped was still there. But when I finally emerged from the bunker hours later, looking out over the horizon, there were no city lights in the distance, no satellites in the sky. The world was dark. The blackout had begun.